Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're analyzing what is undeniably one of the most consequential geopolitical events of our time. We are talking about the unprecedented joint United States and Israeli military campaign across Iran. Officially, the Pentagon is calling this Operation Epic Fury.
Yeah, it's an absolutely massive operation.
It is, and the central question we really must grapple with today is pretty stark. Are we witnessing a necessary, decisive, and entirely justified intervention to neutralize an imminent existential nuclear and ballistic threat? Or, and this is the crux of the disagreement, is this a dangerously escalatory, unauthorized act of war that sabotages ongoing diplomacy and triggers, frankly, unpredictable regional chaos?
Right, and that's exactly where we diverge.
Exactly. I take the position that these strikes, while undeniably massive in scale, represent an urgent, necessary defense against a regime on the precipice of nuclear armament. And beyond that, I believe this campaign offers a critical, perhaps singular opportunity to support the Iranian people in finally dismantling a radical dictatorship.
And I take the contrasting view. This military campaign, from my perspective, constitutes a perilous and legally unauthorized escalation. By launching a widespread attack right in the middle of active negotiations, the United States has deliberately sabotaged ongoing diplomatic channels. Furthermore, launching a broad-scale war aimed at regime change based on suddenly urgent, localized intelligence, it just risks catastrophic regional blowback. I argue that we are repeating the darkest historical blunders of forced regime change, and, well, the fallout is already spiraling beyond control.
Okay, but to truly understand the necessity of this operation, we really have to look unblinkingly at the reality of the threat landscape. This isn't just some theoretical exercise in a war room, It is an absolute necessity to prevent a nuclear Iran. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has explicitly characterized the Iranian regime as an existential threat, and President Trump has made it very clear that the core objective here is to eliminate imminent threats from a republic that is actively trying to rebuild and really accelerate its nuclear program.
But the definition of imminent is exactly what's up for debate here.
Well, we are talking about an adversary that has stockpiled tens of thousands of ballistic missiles. As the Prime Minister noted, every military action involves risk, sure, but the risk of doing nothing is far greater. And beyond the sheer strategic calculus, I argue there is a profound moral imperative here. We have all watched the brutal crackdown on widespread street protests by this regime over the years. In his address to the Iranian people, President Trump stated that the help they've asked for has finally arrived, urging them to take over their government. So yes, it's a regrettable, violent use of force, but ultimately essential to eliminate a global threat and liberate a captive populace.
Right. Look, I understand the desire to frame this as a moral rescue mission, but the reality on the ground tells a much darker story. This operation is fundamentally reckless, historically blind, and democratically unauthorized. Let's just look at the immediate domestic alarm right here in the United States. Congressman Thomas Massie, a Republican, mind you, has explicitly called this an unauthorized act of war.
He did say that, yes.
And Congressman Ro Khanna has demanded lawmakers return to Washington for a Monday vote because there has been absolutely no congressional approval for an operation of this sheer magnitude. Furthermore, the extreme danger of launching a broad-scale attack while we are actively at the negotiating table, it just cannot be overstated. We had ongoing back-channel talks in Oman and Geneva. Technical talks were actually scheduled to take place at the UN Atomic Agency in Vienna. To bomb a country while negotiating with them is a catastrophic diplomatic failure. And really, we must immediately dispense with this narrative of a clean, targeted liberation. Iranian media reports indicate that 40 people have already been killed at a primary school in the south of the country. This tragic civilian cost undercuts the entire notion that this is a precise or humanitarian endeavor.
I hear you. And you bring up the civilian cost, which is undeniable and always devastating. Nobody is debating that. But if we zoom out to the broader timeline, that tragedy doesn't negate the imminence of the threat that necessitated this action in the first place. Let's examine the intelligence and the strategic objective here. The explicit goal articulated by the administration is to destroy Iran's missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. We've seen the massive military buildup that Iran has engaged in over the past year. More importantly,
We have empirical proof that limited, proportionate actions simply do not work against the specific regime.
Wait, are you referring to the strikes last summer?
Exactly. Look at Operation Midnight Hammer in June of 2025. That was a textbook surgical strike. It targeted only the nuclear facilities. The international community largely accepted it. And what was the actual result?
Well,
It entirely failed to curb the regime's ambitions. They didn't come to the table humbled. They dug their facilities deeper, they rebuilt, they escalated, and they accelerated their program. The sudden urgency we are seeing now isn't manufactured out of thin air. It is dictated by the adversary's timeline, not our political calendar.
I have to push back hard on that framing, though. The sudden urgency you're citing is exactly what demands the highest level of scrutiny, especially when it risks American casualties. The vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Mark Warner, put it perfectly. He noted that we have heard claims of the, quote, urgency of American intelligence before. He was clearly drawing parallels to the faulty intelligence that led us into the Iraq War.
But come on, the geopolitical context of Iraq in 2003 and Iran today are entirely different. You can't just copy-paste that scenario.
The context might be different, sure, but the structural warning about executive overreach is exactly the same. Are we really supposed to accept that an 8-minute social media video posted by the president is sufficient justification for a massive, multi-front military campaign? When the justification for bypassing Congress and launching an unprecedented bombing campaign is a sudden, localized intelligence assessment that the American public and most lawmakers aren't even allowed to see, history tells us we are walking into a disaster. The parallel to Iraq is not just rhetorical, it's a fundamental warning about the manipulation of intelligence to justify pre-existing desires for regime change.
I see why you draw that parallel, but let me offer a different perspective on the regime change aspect. The comparison to Iraq assumes a generalized, unfocused military occupation aimed at rebuilding a state from scratch. This campaign is vastly different. It relies on a highly targeted decapitation strategy aimed precisely at the architecture of the dictatorship itself. Look at the tactical execution we've seen so far. 7 missiles directly hit the presidential palace. There have been massive, coordinated strikes around Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's compound.
But decapitation strikes are inherently destabilizing.
They are, but that destabilization is the point. The explicit targeting of President Masoud Pezeshkian and the Supreme Leader is a strategic necessity. You cannot separate the nuclear ambition from the men who order it. By decapitating the regime, the United States is fulfilling a promise to the Iranian people. It's giving them a window of chaos within the state security apparatus. Without the Revolutionary Guard able to coordinate a crackdown, the citizens finally have the space to rise up. As the president said, this will probably be their only chance for generations to take their country back.
That is a very compelling argument in theory, but have you considered the reality on the ground versus the neat, theoretical playbook of a decapitation strategy? Forced regime change is never clean. It almost never results in the democratic utopia the architects envision. Right now, there is an absolute internet blackout across Iran. We are seeing major blasts across multiple urban centers: Isfahan, Karajah, Kermanshah, Qom, Bushehr, and Mehrabad Airport just outside Tehran.
Which, to be fair, are heavily fortified military and logistical hubs.
Yes, but they are also densely populated civilian areas. The state television is currently broadcasting emergency warnings, calling the U.S. and Israel corrupt regimes, and telling citizens to flee to other cities to stay safe from their evils. You are relying on a spontaneous, perfectly organized democratic uprising in the middle of a nationwide bombing campaign where communications are completely down and city infrastructure is literally burning. When bombs fall, populations historically rally around the flag or they panic. They don't instantly draft a constitution. We've run this exact experiment before. Look at Libya. Look at Iraq. Removing a strongman does not magically produce a stable democracy overnight. Historically, it produces unpredictable escalation, sectarian violence, and a massive power vacuum that much worse actors inevitably fill.
I hear your concerns about a power vacuum. I really do. But I have to ask, what is the alternative here? If we know they are months or even weeks away from an unstoppable nuclear threshold, how long do we let diplomacy stall? Your argument assumes that diplomatic alternative was actually viable. It was not.
Iran was using the negotiations in Oman and Geneva as a shield. It was a stalling tactic to buy time for their nuclear enrichment and ballistic missile production.
But you don't solve stalled diplomacy by bombing the negotiating table.
You do if the table is a distraction. What you call diplomatic sabotage, I call necessary strategic ambiguity. By strategic ambiguity, I mean the administration deliberately kept their cards hidden to prevent Iran from moving their most valuable assets deep underground. President Trump intentionally maintained this ambiguity, stating publicly he hadn't made his mind up yet just to keep the Iranian regime off balance. Meanwhile, the U.S. prepared the biggest military buildup in the Middle East in 20 years. If you broadcast your intentions to a rogue state, you lose the element of surprise against a regime that has spent decades fortifying its bunkers. The fact that technical talks were scheduled in Vienna was completely irrelevant to the regime's actual on-the-ground military acceleration. Epic fury was the decisive action required when diplomacy becomes nothing more than a smokescreen.
But by attacking during active negotiations, the United States makes itself a dangerous and fundamentally untrustworthy partner on the global stage. Diplomacy relies on a very basic premise: trust. If you were sitting at a table in Amman, holding back-channel talks in Geneva, and formally scheduling technical talks at the UN Atomic Agency in Vienna, all while secretly arming the biggest military buildup in 20 years to launch a surprise decapitation strike, why would any nation ever negotiate with the United States again?
Because they will understand that the United States will not allow diplomatic protocols to be weaponized against global security.
No, they will understand that negotiating with this administration is inherently dangerous. You permanently damage future diplomatic credibility. You say the talks were a stalling tactic, but the mid-negotiation strike proves to the world that our diplomatic word is meaningless. You cannot build a stable global order if the punishment for engaging in technical atomic agency talks is having your capital city leveled by airstrikes.
The global order is already fundamentally threatened when a designated state sponsor of terror is allowed to build tens of thousands of ballistic missiles. Let's look at the regional defense posture, which I believe entirely justifies the necessity and scale of this strike. Israel understood the magnitude of this threat. They didn't just launch planes, they fundamentally altered their society's posture. They declared a special and permanent state of emergency. They called up 70,000 reservists. They completely closed their airspace, shut down all schools, and closed access to holy sites.
Which shows how terrified they were of the inevitable blowback.
It shows they were realistic about what dismantling this threat required. And they were right to do so because the defensive preparations were immediately tested. The Iron Dome missile defenses had to be activated almost instantly against incoming fire. The rigorous nature of these defensive preparations proves that the intelligence was accurate and the threat was real. The Iranian retaliation started within an hour. If the U.S. and Israel had not acted preemptively to destroy these missile capabilities on the ground, the eventual unprovoked barrage from Iran, perhaps armed with nuclear payloads down the line, would have been devastating.
Highlighting the retaliation actually proves my point about the immediate and uncontainable regional blowback. You say the robust defense justifies the strike, but the strike is what triggered the massive regional spillover we are currently witnessing. The retaliation hasn't just been aimed at Israel. The blowback is everywhere. The U.S. naval base in Bahrain, which is the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet and essentially the anchor of U.S. naval power in the region, has come under attack. Qatar, which hosts the Al Udeid Air Base, the central nervous system for U.S. air operations in the Middle East, has seen impacts. Missiles have been fired into Kuwait, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia.
Which demonstrates the sprawling, cancerous nature of Iran's proxy network.
It demonstrates that we have ignited a regional war. And let's look at the fatal consequences outside of Iran's borders. We already have reports of 1 person killed in the United Arab Emirates and 4 people dead in Syria simply from missile debris. Think about how that changes the calculus for those Gulf nations. The last time Iran struck U.S. assets, it was heavily telegraphed and largely performative. Not this time. Drones are being intercepted over Iraq as we speak. The conflict has already escalated dangerously beyond anyone's control. You aimed for a surgical decapitation, and within hours, you've ignited a multi-nation conflict spanning from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf.
That regional friction, as violent as it is right now, was inevitable. The question was never if we would face this friction, but when, whether it happened today on our terms or 5 years from now on an atomic-armed Iran's terms. The scale of the blowback you just detailed merely underscored how deeply entrenched and dangerous the Iranian military apparatus had become. If they are capable of simultaneously targeting Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia within hours, then they possessed an offensive capability that was entirely incompatible with long-term regional peace.
But we triggered the absolute worst-case scenario of that capability.
We forced their hand before they had a nuclear umbrella to protect that capability. We have to look at the long game here. Senator Lindsey Graham articulated this perfectly. He said, yes, this campaign will be a violent one, but it is an unprecedented opportunity to reshape the Middle East. Operation Epic Fury represents a necessary paradigm shift. By removing the existential threat of an Iranian nuclear and ballistic arsenal, we are excising the primary driver of regional instability. The short-term fallout is undeniably severe, yes, but the long-term stabilization of the Middle East requires the definitive dismantling of this regime's military capacity.
Reshaping the Middle East through massive, unprovoked bombing campaigns is a terrifying echo of the exact rhetoric used to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It didn't work then, and the early hours of this campaign suggest it won't work now. To summarize my position, launching an unauthorized, broad-scale war aimed at regime change based on sudden intelligence claims and a short social media video is a repetition of our most disastrous historical blunders. We are witnessing immediate regional destabilization. American troops of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and Al Udeid in Qatar are currently under fire. Dozens of innocent people, including children at a primary school, are dead. We have shattered our diplomatic credibility by bombing a negotiating partner mid-talks. This is not a surgical removal of a threat. It is the reckless ignition of a regional powder keg that will draw American blood and treasure into a chaotic, unpredictable conflict for decades to come.
And to summarize my stance, I maintain that despite the undeniable risks, the severe immediate fallout, and the tragic loss of civilian life, this campaign represents a necessary, albeit violent, opportunity. The failure of past limited strikes proved that a massive, decisive blow is the only way to neutralize an imminent nuclear threat and offer the Iranian people a genuine chance at liberation. But while we clearly disagree fundamentally on the justification and wisdom of this military campaign, I believe we do find convergence on one absolute reality. The sheer scope of these strikes represents a permanent shift in Middle Eastern geopolitics. We are far beyond the era of limited, proportionate engagements. The previous status quo, that delicate, tension-filled balance of power, has been permanently shattered.
I agree entirely on that point. This is significantly more expansive than any past surgical strike. The decision to explicitly target the presidential palace, the supreme leader's compound, and civilian-adjacent infrastructure across half a dozen major Iranian cities, it marks the definitive end of the previous geopolitical paradigm. There is no going back to the negotiation table after this. The architecture of the Middle East has been permanently altered, for better or worse.
It truly reflects the deep, almost intractable complexity of addressing nuclear proliferation when it is intertwined with authoritarian, hostile regimes. There are so many variables that are currently in motion right now. The ultimate validity of the underlying intelligence regarding the imminence of the nuclear threat will undoubtedly be scrutinized by history.
Exactly. And the ultimate reaction of the Iranian people on the streets, whether they can or will rise up amidst the rubble, the fear, and the internet blackouts as the administration hopes, that remains to be seen. Furthermore, the full extent of the regional blowback and whether this spirals into a prolonged, multi-front war involving neighboring Gulf states, those are critical areas we must watch closely as this unprecedented situation develops.
Absolutely. The days ahead will test the resilience of the region and the strategic foresight of this campaign. We leave it to you, our listeners, to evaluate the evidence, the historical precedents, and the unfolding realities on the ground to form your own conclusions. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.